Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host Mitch, glad to have you here. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we're all about Commander on a budget. Today's episode is going to be a $50 deck tech. When I say $50, I mean that is an overall deck cost. Both shipping and commanders that are $10 or less are going to be included in that cost, but basic lands will not be. Decks on this channel are built to be fun, inexpensive, and focused. If you want to learn more about what a focused commander deck is, check out this video here. On this deck tech, I'm going to take you through its strategy, the tactics, and how this deck wins. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. And while you're at it, subscribe and review our podcast as well. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCGplayer affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all of their support. Today's episode is actually a patron-selected deck tech. Once a month, patrons vote on what commander they'd like to see in an upcoming episode. Whatever commander gets the most votes, wins. And the commander they chose was Alela, Artful Provocateur. Alela is a 2/3 fairy warlock with flying, death touch, and lifelink and costs 1 white, blue, black. She has other creatures you control with flying get +1/+0. And whenever you cast an artifact or enchantment spell, create a 1/1 blue fairy creature token with flying. Alela can be taken in a lot of different directions, but the most powerful direction in my opinion is with artifacts. In my opinion, it's a lot easier to abuse artifacts than it is enchantments. So you can cast a ton of them quickly and get an unstoppable army of fairies in no time. And because those fairies are basically 2/1 flyers, they can pack a good punch. With an army of them, it won't take long for you to knock all of your opponents out. So what's our strategy with this deck? We're going to cast and recast artifacts to make a ton of fairy tokens. We're going to have plenty of ways to bounce artifacts back to our hand and even to cast them for free. And then how we win with this deck is very simple. We're going to pump our army and demolish our opponents. So on top of our Commander's Anthem effect, we have some others in this deck as well if we need them. As with all Commander's Quarters decks, I'm going to take you through 10 different tactics that show you how the deck works and how we're going to win with it. So let's start things off with tactic number 1, Power Up. First up, there's Wayfarer's Bauble, which we can pay 2 and tap and sacrifice to get a basic land into play tapped. Next up, we've got 3 mana rocks that cost 2 and tap for our colors with Guardian Idol, Mind Stone, and Prismatic Lens. Guardian Idol does come into play tapped, but we can also pay 2 to make it into a 2/2 until end of turn. And then by paying 1 and tapping and sacrificing Mind Stone, we can draw a card. Prismatic Lens can actually help us filter our mana by paying 1 and tapping it. Next up, there's Marble Diamond, which comes into play tapped and it taps for a white. And then when Pillar of Origins comes into play, we're going to choose Fairy, so it can add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool as long as we spend that mana to cast a fairy spell. Essentially, the faster that we can get our commander out, the better. So even though this will only really ramp us to cast her, it's going to be worth it. Next up, there's Fear the Suns, which comes into play tapped, but we can tap it for 1 mana of any color 3 times. And then Star Compass also comes into play tapped and can tap for any of our colors depending on our land situation. Then there's Talisman of Hierarchy, which can tap for our colors or can tap for white or black, but it's going to deal 1 damage to us. And finally, we're running all 3 of our signets with Dimir, Azorius, and Orzhov. By paying 1 and 2 and tapping them, they add their guild's colors. Most of the ramp in this deck is going to be on turn 2, so we can get our commander out on turn 3. And we're not quite done with ramping just yet. So it's time for us to move on to tactic number 2, more power. First up, there's Mannequin, which costs 2 and taps for colorless. And then we've got some more mana dorks with Silver Mirror, Leaden Mirror, and Gold Mirror. Each of them costs 2 and tap for a different one of our colors. So again, ramping on turn 2 is crucial to get our commander out on turn 3. And then once she's out, we can fill the board with more artifacts and create more fairies. Next up, we're running Clock of Omens, which isn't technically a ramp spell, but it really is in this deck. It says tap 2 untapped artifacts you control, untap target artifact. So essentially with this in play, we can tap 2 artifacts that don't produce mana to untap 1 that does. But a card that even lets us utilize our fairies for mana is Chief Engineer. It says artifact spells you cast have Convoke. So essentially we can use our creatures to help pay for their costs by tapping them. And finally, we're even running Traveler's Amulet and Wanderer's Twig, which don't ramp us, but they do help us fix our mana. By paying 1 and sacrificing them, we get a basic land into our hand. In this 3-color deck especially, it's important that we fix our mana early. But we actually have some even more effective ways at ramping in a different way. So now let's move on to tactic number 3, less is more. First up, we've got Ethereum Sculptor, Foundry Inspector, and Joyous Familiar, which essentially do the exact same thing for this deck. They make our artifact spells cost 1 less to cast. Now this might seem like a small effect, but it's actually pretty huge for this deck. On their own, they reduce the cost of our artifacts and even make some of them free. And together, they make even more of our artifacts free to cast. The more artifacts that we can cast at a reduced cost or free, the more we can cast in a turn. The more that we cast, the more fairies we make, and the quicker we get ahead of our opponents. A quick note that Joyous Familiar actually makes historic spells cost 1 less to cast, so that includes artifacts, legendaries, and sagas. We're not actually running any sagas in this deck, but it will help reduce the cost of our commander. Regardless, while each of these are very good in this deck, they're not quite as good as the Golden Pig. And the Golden Pig is going to be our number 1 card out of our 99. And the Golden Pig for this deck is Semblance Anvil. Semblance Anvil is an artifact that costs 3 and it has imprint. When Semblance Anvil enters the battlefield, you may exile a non-land card from your hand. Spells you cast that share a card type with the exiled card cost 2 less to cast. So at the cost of exiling 1 artifact from our hand, all of our artifacts cost 2 less to cast. And because the vast majority of our artifacts cost 2 or less, this makes them free to cast. This can lead to some very explosive turns just on its own. Once we're set up properly, it allows us to cast and recast a ton of artifacts for free. It can put us way ahead of our opponents like no other card can, and that's why it's the Golden Pig. But what are some of those artifacts that we want to cast for free? Let's go over them now in tactic number 4, Needed Sacrifices. First up, there's Conjurer's Bauble, which is essentially a 1-mana cantrip. By tapping and sacrificing it, we can put up to 1 target card from our graveyard on the bottom of our library and draw a card. And again, if we've got a cost reducer, we can cast this for free. Artifacts that can draw us cards for cheap are crucial for this deck. So we're also running Darkwater Egg, Skycloud Egg, and Terrarion. By paying 2 and sacrificing Darkwater Egg, we add blue-black to our mana pool and we draw a card. Skycloud Egg does the exact same thing, but it adds white-blue. And then Terrarion is essentially the same, but it does come into play tapped and it gives us 2 mana of any combination of colors. Essentially, these are ways to help us fix mana as well as give us free card draw because they are replacing the mana that we put into them. In a similar way, we're also running Chromatic Sphere and Barbed Sextant. By paying 1 to tap and sacrifice Chromatic Sphere, we add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool and we draw a card. Barbed Sextant does the same thing, but we draw a card at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep instead of right away. Next up, we've got 3 artifacts that can also deal with graveyards with Soul Guide Lantern, Scrabbling Claws, and Phyrexian Furnace. When Soul Guide Lantern enters the battlefield, we exile target card from a graveyard. And we can either tap and sacrifice it to exile each opponent's graveyard or pay 1 to tap and sacrifice it to draw a card. And then Scrabbling Claws has tap, target player exiles a card from their graveyard and pay 1 to sacrifice it, exile a card from a graveyard, draw a card. Phyrexian Furnace essentially does the exact same thing, but it exiles the bottom card of a graveyard when we tap it. And finally, we're running 3 Spell Bombs with Aether, Necrogen, and Sunbeam. With these, we can pay 1 to sacrifice them to draw a card. Or Aether Spellbomb can bounce a creature, Necrogen Spellbomb can make someone discard a card, and Sunbeam Spellbomb can gain us 5 life. But most of the time, we are going to use them to draw. But we're not quite done with artifacts that draw us cards just yet. So let's move on to tactic number 5, Can Trip. First up, we've got some artifacts that might not look like it, but they're some of the best artifacts in this deck. Each of these cost 2 and draws a card when they come into play. Now, some of them do have other effects that can help us out, like fixing our mana, but the main thing is that when they come into play, they draw us a card. So unlike the previous artifacts that we talked about, we don't have to sacrifice them to draw. So if we can bounce them back to our hand and recast them, we can draw more cards with them. So we're also running some more artifacts that cost 2 and draw us a card with Prophetic Prism, Sabo's Web, and Alchemist's Vial. Again, each of these has other effects as well, but the main thing that they do for us is that they draw us a card when they come into play. If we've got a cost reducer or 2 in play, these are essentially free card draw spells. So we're also running 2 more that essentially do the same thing with Ichor Wellspring and Metal Spinner's Puzzle Knot. Now with the Puzzle Knot, we have to be a little careful since it does lose us 1 life when it comes into play. But 1 life for 1 card is pretty much always worth it in Commander. A final 2 mana artifact that doesn't draw us a card when it comes into play, but it does later, is Tome of Legends. It enters the battlefield with a page counter on it, and whenever our commander enters the battlefield or attacks, we put a page counter on it. And we can pay 1 to tap and remove a page counter from it to draw a card. Because our commander has flying, it's going to be very easy for us to attack and get more page counters on this. And 1 mana to draw a card each turn is a very good deal. But we're still not quite done with card advantage and card selection just yet. So now let's move on to tactic number 6, Fuel for the Cause. First up, we've got 2 fantastic creatures to have in play with Artificer's Assistant and Riddlesmith. The Assistant says whenever you cast a Historic spell, scry 1. And Riddlesmith says whenever you cast an artifact spell, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. So while these don't provide card advantage, they do provide us a ton of card selection. Essentially, whenever we cast an artifact, they're going to help us get rid of dead cards and make sure that we can draw into something better. Next up, we've got an artifact that can help as well with Midnight Clock. It can tap for a blue, and we can pay 2 and a blue to put an hour counter on Midnight Clock. And then it has at the beginning of each upkeep, put an hour counter on Midnight Clock. When the 12th hour counter is put on Midnight Clock, shuffle your hand and graveyard into your library, then draw 7 cards, exile Midnight Clock. Because this happens each upkeep, essentially in a game of Commander, we can just wait 3 turns around the table and then this will activate. We can also speed that process up if we want to put some mana into it as well. With all the mana ramp that we're running, this can be well worth it to refuel our entire hand at once. And then we've got Trading Post, which is a very versatile card. We can pay 1 to tap and discard a card and gain 4 life, or we can pay 1 life and create a 0/1 goat creature token, or we can sacrifice a creature and return target artifact card from our graveyard to our hand, or we can sacrifice an artifact and draw a card. The last 2 abilities on this card are probably the ones that we're going to use the most and they can come in really handy. But perhaps the best way to draw a ton of cards at once comes with Biden of Thassa. It says whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card, and by paying 1 in a blue and tapping it, creatures your opponents control attack this turn of Fable. So not only is this going to draw us an incredible amount of cards with our fairies, but it can also make our opponents attack into inopportune situations. But in order for us to actually gain card advantage from this, we have to make sure that our fairies stay on the board. So now let's move on to tactic number 7, Stick Around. First up, there's Etchings of the Chosen, which when it comes into play, we're going to choose faeries. Then our faeries get +1/+1, and by paying 1, we can sacrifice a fairy, and then target creature gains indestructible until end of turn. So this is an anthem that also lets us protect our commander and our other key pieces too. But we also have some ways to protect all of our creatures with Make a Stand and Rootborn Defenses. Make a Stand is going to give all of our creatures indestructible and +1/+0 until end of turn. And then Rootborn Defenses says populate, creatures you control gain indestructible until end of turn. So Make a Stand can help our fairies hit harder, and Rootborn Defenses can make another fairy. But we also have some other ways to protect our things too. Let's go over them now in tactic number 8, Access Denied. First up, there's Negate, which is going to counter-target non-creature spell. And then there's Unwind, which does the same thing, but we also untap up to 3 lands. Next up, there's Rewind, which is similar. It's going to counter-target spell, and we untap up to 4 lands. Now, once we're protected and set up, we can really go off with some of our next cards. So let's go over them now in tactic number 9, Start Anew. First up, there's Hercule's Recall, which says return all artifacts target player owns to their hand. And then Rebuild says return all artifacts to the owner's hands, and it's got cycling for 2. Essentially, each of these serve the exact same purpose for us. They bounce all of our artifacts back to our hand. So with all of our mana rocks and mana dorks, we can float a ton of mana and then go off from there. If we get some of our cost reducers out there, our opponents are going to be in big trouble. We can then essentially dump all of our artifacts from our hand back on the battlefield. With our commander in play, we're going to get a fairy for each and every single one that we cast. And then we get any ETBs, including the ones that draw us cards. So this really can help us refuel our hand and keep us going, especially if we draw another one of these bounce spells. Perhaps an even more powerful version of these in certain situations is Paradoxical Outcome. It says return any number of non-land, non-token permanents you control to their owner's hands, draw a card for each card returned to your hand this way. So we can bounce all the artifacts that we want to back to our hand and draw a ton of cards for that. Even something as simple as Aether Gale can come in really handy. It says return 6 target non-land permanents to their owner's hands. So we can bounce some of our things, or we can bounce some of our opponent's things if we need to. But we actually have an even more powerful bounce spell in the stack. Let's go over it and some of our other finishers now in tactic number 10, Mischief Managed. And that bounce spell is the very powerful Temporal Fissure. It says return target permanent to its owner's hand, and it has Storm. So essentially when we cast this spell, we copied for each spell cast before it this turn, and we can choose new targets for the copies. So for all those artifacts that we're casting and bouncing and recasting, we get to bounce more things. We can either bounce our own artifacts again, or if we have a high enough storm count, we can just bounce all of our opponent's permanents. In reality, we really only need to bounce their lands to take them out. Even if they have a few things on the board, if they have no lands in play, it's going to be very hard for them to come back. Regardless, this is a very flexible card and a very powerful one in this deck. Some more powerful cards come with Mirrored and Besiege and Efficient Construction. Mirrored and Besiege says, as it comes into play, choose either Mirrored or Phyrexian. If you choose Mirrored, whenever you cast an artifact spell, create a 1/1 colorless mirror artifact creature token. And if you choose Phyrexian, at the beginning of your end step, you draw a card and discard a card. Then if there are 15 or more artifact cards in your graveyard, target opponent loses the game. So essentially this can create a ton of tokens for us, or it can help us finish off opponents. And then Efficient Construction says, whenever you cast an artifact spell, create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying. And again, since our commander gives our flying creatures +1/+0, they're going to be 2/1s instead of 1/1s. Basically, these can double up the number of creature tokens that we get whenever we cast an artifact. Next up, we're running some Anthem effects with Hall of Triumph, Heraldic Banner, and Warhorn. Hall of Triumph is going to give all of our blue creatures +1/+1. And Heraldic Banner gives all of our blue creatures +1/+0, and it can tap for a blue. And then Warhorn gives all of our attacking creatures +1/+0. And finally, we can even kill with commander damage with Cranial Plating. It says equipped creature gets +1/+0 for each artifact you control, and you can pay black to attach it to target creature you control. With this deck, this can easily turn our commander into a 2 or even 1-shot kill. And we can even just move it around at instant speed on any creature just to make sure we can get that damage through. Again, Alela can be built in a lot of different directions, but I think artifacts is the most effective way to do it. A big thanks to my patrons for choosing Alela. This was a lot of fun to build around. But now that we've gone through the spells in this deck, let's go on to the mana base. First up, there's Command Tower, which can tap for 1 mana of any color, and Exotic Orchard can tap for 1 mana of any color most of the time. Next up, there's Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, both of which we can tap and sacrifice to get a base land and play tapped. And we can do the same thing with Warp Landscape and Terminal Rain if we pay 2 and tap and sacrifice them instead. Next up, we're running 3 of the Panoramas with Esper, Grixis, and Bant. And then there's Arcane Sanctum, which comes into play tapped and taps for any of our colors. Finally, we're running 22 basic lands, 16 of those are going to be an island, 4 will be a plains, and 2 will be a swamp. And now that we've gone through every single card in this deck, let's do a quick price check. A quick reminder that our deck costs are calculated using TCGplayer optimization, optimizing with even heavily played and damaged cards because those cards need a home too. The average Alela EDH Rec deck will set you back $417.93. Our deck is going to be much more affordable, coming in at $49.19. Again, the price of this deck is the price that I got for it on the day that I'm recording. If you want to see a breakdown of this deck's cost, check out the link in the description. Keep in mind that prices can and will fluctuate and change over time. But with these deck costs, I want to be as transparent as I possibly can. Again, Commander's Quarters decks are about to be tuned and focused within their budget, but there are always ways that we can improve on them. So let's go through some reasonable upgrades now to see what some of those ways just might be. First up, let's add in Spellstutter Sprite by taking out Rewind. Next up, let's add in Site of Ancestry by taking out Midnight Clock. And then let's add in Skullclamp by taking out Trading Post. Next, let's add in Master Thopterus by taking out Hall of Triumph. And then let's add in Retract by taking out Mannequin. Finally, let's add in Obelisk of Erd by taking out Warhorn. And now it's my turn to hear from you. So in the comments below, let me know what you think about this deck and what you think about the commander in general. And make sure you're following us on social media for more updates and sneak peeks on future episodes. Again, a huge thank you to my patrons who help make this show possible. I truly couldn't do any of this without your support. If you want to support this channel directly, consider becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, including being able to vote on future commanders for deck techs. There are even tiers where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. You can check out all the Patreon tiers and rewards at patreon.com/commandersquarters. If you haven't already, make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we're all about budget commander. So while you're at it, go ahead and check out some of our other types of episodes. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again and have a good one.